Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aisling Gillen. I'm a Senior Research Fellow with the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre at the University of Galway. You're very welcome to the first of our three-part webinar series on complexity theory for better child protection and welfare and public services. As some of you may know, my practice and leadership background is public service delivery systems, and particularly child protection and welfare. I have come to the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre at the University of Galway to create a programme of research and action focused on complexity theory. Our guiding philosophy for the complexity work programme is, since complexity is a feature of modern public service provision, rather than fear and seek to simplify it, we need to harness it for better outcomes for children and for citizens. Specifically, the aim of our webinar series is to increase insights into how complexity theory, frameworks, and approaches can help practitioners, managers, leaders, and academics to better understand and engage with complexity at practice, service, and system levels. And in this first webinar, we are focused on complexity theory and child protection and welfare work. We're working on trying to understand the systemic and dynamic characteristics of complexity and how adopting a complexity lens can contribute to better risk management, judgments, and decision-making in complex child protection and welfare practice, services, and systems. Our speaker today is Professor Rick Hood from Kingston University, London. I want to welcome Professor Hood. He has explored the nature of change in complex cases and the challenges associated with making judgments and decisions and managing risks and relationships in social work practice through a complexity lens. He is a registered social worker with over 20 years experience in statutory child and family social work. Professor Rick Hood teaches across a range of modules in pre- and post-qualifying social work courses. His research involves applying systems ideas to social care, particularly services for children and families. One of his main publications is Complexity in Social Work, published in 2018. Now, we have two respondents today. The first of these respondents is Professor Caroline McGregor, professor at the School of Political Science and Sociology, with lead responsibility for the discipline of social work at the University of Galway. She is the director of the Masters in Social Work programme and teaches a range of subjects, including social work with vulnerable children and families, childhood and children's rights, law and human rights, and cultural competence in social work. Caroline is also a senior research fellow at the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre. Our second respondent is Mr. Cormac Quinlan, Assistant National Director for Practice Reform in TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency in Ireland. Cormac is a registered social worker and has worked in the area of child protection and welfare since 1997. He tutors on the Masters in Social Work in Trinity College Dublin and also has held the positions of both chair and members of the Social Work Registration Board here in Ireland. Cormac is the national lead in TUSLA, Child and Family Agency, for the development and implementation of consistent practice approaches across the organisation. So Professor Rick Hood will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Professor Caroline McGregor from the University of Galway, and then Mr. Cormac Quinlan from TUSLA, Child and Family Agency. The respondents will consider what complexity theory offers and can offer to child protection and welfare work, and how it might aid risk management, judgments, and decision-making, practice, service, and system levels. I'm now going to pass you over, it's my pleasure to pass you over to John Canavan, Director of the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, who will say a few words before we pass over to Professor Rick Hood.
Thanks very much, Aisling, and again, just a warm welcome to our participants this afternoon. As you can see, we've started bang on time. We're keen to stick to time. My job today, and just to say, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the centre here, the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, based in the Institute for Life Course and Society at the University of Galway, and I'm a personal professor in the School of Political Science and Sociology. Anyway, my job is a simple one today, which is to moderate the Q&A and just to keep an eye on what people are saying and questions you're raising, and seeing if we can have a fruitful discussion at the end of our webinar. So that's really it. I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to hand you back to Aisling, and Aisling is going to formally introduce Professor Hood. So thank you.
Professor Hood, we'd love to invite you now to present on this topic of complexity theory and child protection and welfare work. So over to you, Rick.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Could you just confirm, Aisling, that that's working?
Yes, perfectly on my side, Rick. Thank
Brilliant. Okay, so I don't need to say any more about myself because that was a brilliant introduction. So I'll get straight on with it since we have quite a busy schedule, I think, for this lunchtime. So I'm going to talk about is some theoretical ideas around complexity, not dwelling too much on the science of complexity, but thinking really about practice implications first, and about implications for organizations, management and design. So first of all, what is complexity? So when we conventionally talk about complexity in everyday life, we tend to mean something that's difficult and challenging. When we look more closely at how the term is used, we can begin to see what it is about complexity that makes things difficult. So one way of getting at this is to think about, well, what's the difference between something that is complex and something that is complicated? So an example of a complicated problem is something we've probably all experienced, which is a car engine that doesn't work. You know, we can't start our car in the morning. Car engine is made up of lots of interconnected components, and when one thing goes wrong, often it leads to other things going wrong. We need, unless it's something straightforward, we usually need a mechanic to help us repair that engine. Now, the thing about a complicated problem like that is that as long as you have a theoretical model, a manual, and as long as you have enough information about the state of the system at the time, the diagnostics, you should be able to fix the problem. So there's a technical solution. Doesn't mean it's easy. That's why you need a car mechanic and why they're paid money. But it's amenable to technical solution. So if you compare that to a complex human problem, which we also all experience, which is loss. Loss is a process. It doesn't necessarily have a clear endpoint. It is difficult to understand. It is unique to the individual in a particular situation at a particular time and in a particular social and cultural context. The skills that are needed to help and support someone through the process of grief are very different from the technical skills needed to fix a complicated problem like a car engine. Now, one of the ways in which we can think about these kind of complex problems is Rittel and Weber's quite well-known concept of wicked problems. So what they mean by this is that, again, there are certain kinds of problem that are not amenable to technical linear solutions. And these are problems that don't necessarily have a definitive formulation. There are various different ways of describing what the problem is, and also various different ways of describing what a solution might look like. So it might be difficult to recognize when an endpoint has been reached. That then also means that there is plenty of scope for disagreement and even conflict and negotiation about problem description and formulating a solution. Wicked problems have a unique configuration. So what works in one case might not work in other cases, or might not work as well. One of the things that unites these kind of problems is that a lot of it is about the interconnection and the unpredictable cause and effect between all the different factors that are at play, including things that lie outside of the problem with which you're immediately concerned. So interactions, patterns of relationships, that brings us on to systems theory. So the complexity, in my way of looking at it, and people look at complexity in all sorts of different ways, is that it's a set of principles about social events and behavior. which derive from scientific theories of complex adaptive systems. And these principles help to explain some of the challenges of working with complex human problems in child welfare, as well as in other domains. And that can help us think about appropriate professional organizational responses. So what are these principles? So obviously there's a huge scientific literature on complexity, which I'm not about to go into, but I think there are 4 principles which it's worth describing briefly. The first is the principle of nonlinearity. So in complex systems, the relationship between cause and effect is not linear. You know, one change doesn't lead proportionately to an effect. It's disproportionate. So it means a small change in one variable can have a very large effect on outcomes. Equally, a very large change in one variable might have no discernible effect at all. It's sometimes a common metaphor for this is the butterfly effect, which you might have heard of. So a butterfly flapping its wings in Tokyo might contribute causally to a tornado in Kansas or somewhere like that. What this means is that because cause and effect are non-linear, that you might not see anything happen for a while, and then suddenly change and transformation is very sudden. So there may be a critical buildup of instability, at which point systems may spontaneously organize themselves into new structures and behavior. So this has been observed in terms of the thermodynamics of fluids, for example, but it also has implications for complex social systems. It means that seemingly minor events and incidents may escalate situations and lead to sudden and unexpected changes in behavior. It means that apparent order, calmness, and stability may actually be disguising potential for volatile change. And it might also mean that a period of heightened instability and uncertainty might actually be necessary for fundamental change to occur. That then links on to the third principle, which is emergence. So these self-organizing local interactions produce global patterns of behavior without this being centrally planned or designed. So an often cited example in nature is the flocking behavior of birds. So it's not as if the birds get together around their leader and say, how do we flock? You know, it's all guided by simple rules about speed and position when flying relative to other birds. And the flocking is the kind of emergent effect of this. In the social context, the implications are that the key drivers of change are relationships and interactions on a localized level. So everyday things, rather than grand designs implemented on a global scale. Of course, we do implement grand designs on a global scale, but what then happens is down to localized interactions. And since structural change emerges through these processes of interaction and feedback, agents can influence other agents in their local context, and that is often all they can do. But the exact nature and degree of this influence can't be known in advance. So there's a lot of uncertainty inherent in complex systems. And finally, because these are systems that operate on the edge of equilibrium, they periodically experience upheaval and transformational change as a way of adapting to the environment and avoiding decay and avoiding obsolescence. So novelty and innovation are hallmarks of complex change, and they often emerge in conditions of instability and disorder. And it means there are unintended consequences. Interventions can give rise to outcomes that they were not intended to produce. So it's worth bearing in mind some of those principles when we now go on to consider some of the practice issues that arise when working with complexity in child welfare. So the first place to start is where we often talk in child welfare about complex needs. And I would argue there are two main ways anyway, of understanding complex needs. One is, maybe it's obvious to say, that all human needs are complex in their own right. And that even applies to needs that, you're probably all familiar with Maslow's pyramid, and the needs at the bottom there, which are called basic. So something like shelter is a basic need, but in an advanced, complex human society, shelter is far from basic. Where you live, not just the physical accommodation, but the place where you live and everything that's associated with it is laden with meaning and significance. And that makes it problematic, of course, because when services and when professionals are assessing needs, they have to judge them on their own merits, but they also have to make utilitarian judgments about what to prioritise when resources are scarce. The problem is, if you treat complex needs as basic, then you overlook the actual meaningfulness of it for the person. So, for example, someone with a housing need might be advised that they can seek, there's accommodation for them 200, 300 miles away from their friends, family, support networks, and their children's school. And it's seen as meeting that need because it's being seen as basic, when in fact it is not basic. It doesn't solve their problem. The other way to look at complex needs is to see it as a type of demand. So this leads you to another pyramid, which is the one that's shown on the slide there. So it's not Maslow's pyramid. This is a tiered pyramid of service provision. So in this sense, at the bottom of the pyramid are needs that are catered for by universal services, such as schools and hospitals. And when children have needs that are in additional to those that require specialist inputs, they're then referred to specialist services. And when children have multiple needs that require specialist input, they are regarded as having complex needs and requiring specialist support from a number of agencies that need to be coordinated and managed in the form of a care plan. So in that sense, complexity then is about multiplicity of need, and it's treated as a type of demand that requires coordination. And this has various implications, which I hope to go through some of now. Maybe just to look at an example. So this is a made up case, but I'm sure many of you all have worked with situations like this. So Clive is experiencing multiple needs, but they're not separate. They all affect each other, of course. There are multiple domains here: alcohol misuse, physical and mental health problems, estrangement from close family, unemployment, involvement in the criminal justice system, and the family history of childhood abuse. Each of these things on their own would be enough to have a significant impact on someone's welfare. The combination of these problems is seen as creating a higher risk, a higher potential for harm to occur to the individual, and also pulling in services, pulling in support from a number of agencies. Of course, the problem is each agency deals with one aspect of this, but a person is a person. They all interact and they all affect each other, such as the coexistence of mental health problems in dual diagnosis with drug or alcohol problems. It's impossible to address one if you don't address the other, and yet they are enmeshed in such a way it's difficult to find appropriate treatment. So understanding and addressing these kinds of needs is often said to require a holistic way of working. And this is something where we'll come back to. So just pause for a moment. I was going to say a lot more about complexity, but just so far might be worth thinking about a complex piece of work that you've undertaken, people listening to this, and what you think are the things that made it complex. Is it the relationships? Is it the multiplicity of need? Is it complex needs being treated as basic? And are there any parallels between those things and the sort of the theoretical concepts that are discussed so far? Okay, moving now from complex needs to a related practice issue, which is volatility and drift, which seem like very different kinds of things, and I would argue they're different facets of the same phenomenon, which is complexity. Now, complex systems, as I've said, exist right on the edge of equilibrium, between equilibrium and chaos. By definition, they never settle into a stable state. They always have the potential for change, which could be triggered by the most minor of events. And of course, professionals themselves are in the business of change and achieving change. And so there is many different ways in which this can be experienced and perceived. One of them is in the form of volatility. So volatility is tends to be ascribed to situations, sometimes even people, that appear unstable, likely to explode suddenly into action and raise our anxieties about safety and vulnerability. So when dealing with volatile situations, practitioners tend to be on high alert, geared up for unexpected developments. These are the cases that keep us up at night, make us worry to open our emails in the morning. It's because it's associated with higher risk. Drift, on the other hand, is kind of more of a slow-moving negative spiral or state of paralysis. So progress seems to be short-lived, repeated setbacks. And these cases don't maybe provoke the same amount of angst, but a sense of frustration and helplessness. The situation seems to be intractable. We're not getting anywhere. Social workers, professionals feel stuck and wonder if there's anything else that they can do. And you might get a pattern of allocation, reallocation, people wanting to start again and try things that haven't worked in the past. And services constantly want to close these cases, but then find them coming back. Now, these seem to be two sides of the same coin. And in fact, if you step back from very volatile cases, they might start to look a lot like drift. And why is that? It's because we're often engaged in the process of firefighting, moving from one crisis to the next. Not actually trusting periods of calm even, because of the sense there are problems bubbling away underneath the surface. These kind of cases provoke arguments and disagreements in professional networks, both in cases of volatile situations and in cases of drift. How to define what the underlying causes are and what to do about them. Often in practice, we put a big emphasis, certainly in terms of training and educational professionals, on chronologies, case summaries, on identifying and analysing patterns in long-running cases, but also in the value of critical analysis and reflection, to stop us, I suppose, getting either sucked into the constant spiral of firefighting, but also stop us getting paralysed and demotivated, I suppose, from the sense of drift. Here's another example. Again, I mean, when I was in practice, I came across a few cases like this. So the example of a child in care and has been in care for a number of years and a number of placements, and is with a relatively new foster family, and the carers are doing their best, and they value Simon's strengths, and are trying to work with him, but having real trouble managing his behaviour. And of course, as children get older, then this kind of cycle of placement breakdown and disruption and moving to a new placement becomes increasingly concerning, because it becomes linked with educational exclusion and vulnerability to peer exploitation and involvement in child criminal or sexual exploitation. So it tends to lead to a ratcheting effect of worry and concern. What tends to then happen is that the professional network seeks to contain and manage what they see as this volatile, uncontrollable behaviour, focus on behaviour, and that then also manifests itself as splits and disagreement in the network. For example, about how to manage behaviour. So there might be a difference of opinion about a biomedical approach in terms of diagnosing mental health problems and prescribing medication versus the psychodynamic approach in terms of working with trauma and trying to build stability and security for the young person. So generally, when you get this level of need and this level of challenge associated with complex cases, the tendency is for professionals to accumulate. There's some pile-on, and children like this can have up to 20 professionals involved with them. And the way we tend to try to see resolve this is through integrated working. It's seen as the way to resolve this difficulty. Okay, we have lots of professionals involved, so we need to work in an integrated way. Again, it's worth thinking about what the assumptions are behind what we mean when we say integrated working, because of the way organizations and professional disciplines are set up, it tends to involve splitting up and disaggregating complex needs into individual types of need, which can then be addressed. So you might have a mentor to provide positive role model, or a referral to the child adolescent mental health service to address anxiety and depression, or referral to special educational support to try and avoid exclusion from school, etc., therapists. And the idea is that all then gets combined together to produce outcomes for the child. And of course, the problem with the child themselves is one person. You can't split up a child. So we work with, we try and fragment and then build back together. And then we get a real problem in terms of children don't want to be worked with like that. They don't want to have to tell their story to lots of professionals, and they don't want to have to work with lots and lots of social workers, for example. What then happens is a constant management and negotiation, a lot of resources being built into the actual management of the interprofessional network around the child. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I don't think, so we can't say, well, it's a panacea, we need to work together. It's about delving a little bit more deeply into what we're actually doing when we're designing services to meet the needs of children.
Rick, 5 minutes, Aisling here, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, great. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll move on because I think I've said a lot of this already. So I'm going to move on to this. I think this is the final part of the presentation. Just think about what can some of the literature about addressing complexity in organizations and work systems tell us. So again, there's huge literature on this. I like the work of W. Edwards Deeming, who's working in Japan in manufacturing. And it was as well of the work of Taiichi Ono, who developed the Toyota production system. And their focus was on understanding flow, the flow of work, and the reasons for variation in quality in manufacturing. And one of the concepts that was used in this was something called nominal value, which is the sort of ideal that you're aiming for. In manufacturing, that might be the characteristics of a part or of a product. In services, nominal value comes from the person who is receiving services. And in the work of John Seddon, who applies many of Deeming's insights from manufacturing to service industries, the fundamental challenge for services is to design against demand. So to design services in such a way that they understand what matters to people and bring expertise and resources into play as quickly as possible to meet the variety of demand. And some of these concepts and principles are also derived from socio-technical systems theory, which was a big part of the Monroe Review of Child Protection more than 10 years ago. So just to finish with just an illustration of how that might look when you design a service to address complexity. So there's some questions that you can ask yourself. Do you ask yourself what matters to the people who are receiving services? This is different for every person, and what they need immediately should be seen in the context of the bigger picture of their lives. People tend to get referred in a crisis or come to services in a crisis, but actually underlying that is what we call contextual demand, the things that actually matter to them if they're going to live their lives in the way that they would like to. How quickly and accurately can you understand what matters, not just the pressing, immediate presenting issue, but also the contextual demand that underlies it? How fast and flexible can we be in finding the right expertise and resources? So we need dialogue, communication and empathy, but then we also need to put resources in the right place to respond to that. And then finally, how do we know whether we've addressed what actually matters? How are we measuring effectiveness? Often services measure processes, of course, rather than outcomes. Now you might say, well, we do all this. This is what we do. Well, I would argue this is really, the questions that services ask themselves. Okay, So services ask themselves, what information should people be giving us on the form? So there's a form. We prescribe in advance the information people should be giving us. And that might be because we want to be fair, because what we want to do is screen for eligibility. Does this meet the threshold for something we have to do something about? How can we match people to what we have to offer? So we have functional specialization, we have teams that work with X, Y, and Z. Is this X, Y, and Z? As a kind of take it or leave it, really. And if we don't do all that, how can we match demand and control cost? So this is a big problem for services who are incredibly concerned about being overwhelmed by demand for social care and the financial pressures that result from that. And this leads to design issues. I can't speak for Ireland, but in England, we still have a front door to services heavily focused on triage and information gathering. We have multiple contacts, handovers and assessments between different teams and functions. We have a screen and intervene model, pretty much geared to providing rapid response for acute need and high-risk cases. And we overlook contextual demand and try and close down cases as quickly as possible. And a lot of cases come back. We're doing analysis of a large national data set in England, and the repeat referral rate over a 6-year time observation window is nearly 60%. So there's a lot of repeat demand. And then the final slide, have I still got time, Aisling?
Yes, you have 2 minutes, yeah.
Great. Complexity is a learning opportunity for us. So I think it's what can complexity teach us, rather than us saying, oh, we don't know, what to do. Let's stick with what we're doing. The lessons from the organizational management literature is that you have to design in the fundamentals of practice. It's all very well having these brilliant practice models that we're devising for social workers to do their jobs better, which is kind of what we often like to do. But what if they're practicing in institutional organizational contexts that are not aligned with those practice models? Because they can't make up for it, if you like. And this is the huge lessons from socio-technical systems design, is that you need to align the process of design with the objectives of what you want services to achieve. You need minimal critical specification, so you only specify what's essential. Give people clear objectives, but let work groups on the front line find the best way of delivering those objectives. Beware default approaches. The more standardization and prescription you have, the more you cut the variety of provision. And the whole point of complex needs is that there is huge variety. And so the more standardization you have, the less variety you have in the form of provision. The old human relations slogan, if you want people to do a good job, give them a good job to do. We have a huge problem with retention of social workers in England. There are many reasons for this. I think people will often stay in a job that is challenging if they feel that they are helping the people that they're working with and delivering good outcomes for them. And to do that, we need systems that are geared around the changing needs of citizens. So what that means is we can often recognise in our welfare bureaucracies the institutions that were built after the Second World War when the welfare state was constructed. Yet society has changed hugely since then. And how can we adapt what we do to the changing needs of people in contemporary society and the challenges that they face. More to say on all of that, of course, but I think I'm out of time. So thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions or queries, and we'll hand back to you, Aisling.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Hood. I'm going to pass you over to Professor Carolyn McGregor, who is the first of our respondents this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Aisling, and thanks very much, Rick. That was a really, really interesting and very informative presentation. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to give a brief response. I'm very grateful to Aisling for the work that you've kind of led in relation to us engaging more with complexity theory. I remember quite a number of years ago trying with them in another context to apply it, and Rick, the point you made about it being in between equilibrium and chaos led me to read up on chaos theory, thinking it would help me, and it scared me away for a number of years because I just couldn't figure it out at all. So I'm really, really glad to have the opportunity to engage and learn with you. And that's my response today is, I suppose, as a co-learner and a peer, and delighted to do it. So there's so much, I think, Rick, that you've given us in terms of understanding of systems that I'm not going to repeat. But I suppose for me, one of the things that I've always been interested in throughout my career is trying to make sense of child protection and welfare practice and theory, and trying to sort of, find frameworks that help us to understand them and help us to kind of develop practice within it, particularly, I suppose, from an education point of view, from my own experience. And so I would talk about social work in a socio-legal context and trying to capture those sort of dualities. With my colleague, particularly Carmel Devani, sort of the last number of years, I think we've managed to kind of make some progress on kind of framing sort of the complexity and dualities around looking at the relationship between child protection and family support, and thinking about how do we work with families in the middle who are really needing a range of kind of complex interventions, usually not just one single or multiple. And you've really kind of, I suppose, reinforced that today, Rick. And yet, for all of that, I think even myself, I find myself trapped by thinking about duality, because duality in itself is too linear, as you say, and too restricted. So I think systems theory, now I would, sort of up to now, I would sort of more use ecological model, which I think is helpful. But I think what complexity theory is really giving us is a really step much deeper into systems theory that can really help us to move beyond being able to understand, yes, this is very complex, and yes, it's complicated as well, but it's not beyond comprehension. And I suppose what I see in terms of the contribution of complexity theory and the clarity with which you've presented it, Rick, has been excellent, is that it helps us to recognize the complexity, but actually to also find steps to deal with it, as opposed to being overwhelmed by it or feeling this is just too much, or it's too broad, and therefore I can't make a decision about what I'm going to do. So the kind of messages I think that I've picked up from today and sharing with the audience, it's complex, but not it's complex and complicated, but we should expect that, to expect something to be easy in terms of the type of case examples you gave, I think is unrealistic. And I think we'll come back to that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think what's really welcome is that it really pushes us and challenges us for any attempt to have simple, reductionist kind of, that there's an easy answer, whatever, with all due respect to the fantastic practice models that have been developed, like Science of Safety. I know Cormac will talk more about kind of that practice context, or MEHL, or the Barnhouse model, or the assessment frameworks that have been developed over the decades using ecological. They're all fantastic, but they all share the same risk, that if we start to think that this book or this practice model, I mean, in my practice, when I practiced, it was a number of decades ago, it was in the 80s and 90s, it was the Orange Assessment Book. I don't know if any colleagues remember that. We called it the Orange Book, which was the Department of Health Assessment practice model at the time. But as soon as we start thinking that this model therefore tells everything we need to do, or the risk of us in practice thinking that this is the way around the complexity, that's where we're in trouble. So I think that's what we're being offered today, is sort of that kind of empathy with the complexity, but also a set of, I don't feel lost like I did when I started reading chaos theory, and I'm sure there are experts in chaos theory, and I'm no disrespect, I'm sure there's a lot to offer. I just do not yet understand it. But I do now understand complexity theory and can see the contribution that it can make. But just, I'm watching the time, Aisling, don't worry, but there are challenges. So Rick, you talked about disaggregated complex need. And I think, in fairness, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is that we're not doing enough. We're not doing ourselves any favors by how we do some of our business. So we talk about intersectionality and so on, but yet we organize our services in a very sectional way. We separate out children and adult services in a very crude way that has such a fundamental impact for young people transitioning through care, or persons with disability, and for a whole range of different areas. In education, with all due respect to the wonderful work that we all do and those involved do, we don't prepare professionals to work well together. We don't educate in a way that encourages this complex kind of coordinated approach, because we tend to silo professionals before we even let them hit the field. And then we're surprised by disaggregated responses. What you said is just, I've written it down and I'm going to have it. If you don't mind, Rick, I'll be using it for my teaching. You can't split up a child. You know, you can aggregate. We have to have this holistic approach. So I suppose just to kind of finish with some final practice messages that I'm taking away and I'm really grateful for. You talked about, you know, we're looking at all levels of the system, but you made the point that the key driver of change is at the local level. And I think that that's really, really significant, that we recognize that no matter how much we try to use complexity theory to design practice modules and so on, it's the people at the center, the persons involved at that local level who will be implementing that. But also then to kind of see the power of the influence at local level, that we're all part of the system. Everybody here isn't looking in on, we're part of, we all have a little piece in that complex system. And to think about the power and the positive power that we have, that we might be able to exercise in that regard. And what matters most, what matters to the persons that we're working with. You gave some really important, I think, messaging as well that I would have obviously be aware of, but you know, you really framed it really well in terms of the use of critical analysis. You know, we say, I don't have time to stop, I don't have time to sit back and think, but actually it is a way to avoid drift and paralysis. And I think that that's such an important message in terms of the importance of time for reflection and relationships and supervision. So I just want to finish with thanking you, Rick, and thanking you, Aisling and John and Cormac in advance for what he's going to follow up on. It's been a pleasure to be part of this learning journey, and I shall continue to learn. So back to you, Aisling.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor McGregor, for your wonderful insights as usual. I'm going to pass you over now to Mr. Cormac Quinlan, who's our second respondent from Tusla Family Agency.
Good afternoon, everyone, and delighted to be here. And my sincere thanks, first of all, to John, Aisling and NUIG just for the opportunity, I think, to contribute to the discussion. It's been really interesting, Rick, to hear some of the concepts and trying to bring, dare I say, simplicity to complexity. That's not always easy. So that was really welcomed. Thank you. And to Caroline, as always, for her rich insights as well. Maybe before I get into some of the key response points that I want to kind of contribute to the discussion, I suppose I'm just really want to say how much I welcome the debate, I suppose, in relation to what makes, effective child protection welfare practice, or indeed effective systems to support it. I think sometimes we only get to discuss these things typically when something's gone wrong in the system or something's gone wrong for a child. And it's really, really important, I think, that we continue to have this open discussion and think about this, because as well as having informed discussions, we also know that sometimes discussions around child abuse invoke lots of emotional reactions for us as well, whether that's shock, disgust, blame, anger, all of those things. And all of those pepper the discussion and pepper the debate, I think. And I think it speaks often, I suppose, to, I think from a public expectation point of view, what's often kind of maybe understandable and desirable from the child protection welfare system isn't always perhaps realistic or achievable in the same way. And I think maybe some of the concepts you've talked about here and some of the language and framework, I think, helps us to open up a wider debate about that, which I really welcome. But I suppose I wanted to kind of talk about, in terms of some of the concepts and themes I've heard from Rick and even from Caroline today, I suppose I want to kind of frame, I suppose, some of my discussion on some of the practice reform that we have been trying to do in Tusla, and try and see how I can connect some of the concepts and some of the ideas to that, notwithstanding all the complex challenges that even that has thrown up for us, I suppose, in that context. But maybe, and frame it in two ways. One, to talk a little bit about the practice, first of all, and then probably some of the organizational changes to support that practice and how we've tried to think into all of the complexity of that. So maybe just on the practice level, first of all, yes, in 2017, we decided to try and adopt a national approach to practice to bring some needed consistency probably to how we were approaching our work with children and families. And I think picking up on maybe some of the themes you've talked about, I think some of the things we've tried to do in that space is maybe we have sought to probably design in some of those fundamentals of practice into that practice approach, things like the principles and disciplines, the values and behaviors we want from the practice, and core practice methods and learning methods in that context. Also within that, I suppose I'm thinking within some of those practice methods, our approach, and Caroline touched on this, the assessment framework. I remember the Orange Book and the Purple Book as well, and taking sometimes that very linear approach to assessment where we go in, we ask all these questions, we go off into a dark room, we decide what the outcome of the assessment is, and we come back and tell the family what we think. And with the approach that we've tried to adopt this time, I suppose, is to think more, how can we use the assessment framework within science and safety as a more adaptive, flexible model of assessment with families, where we use good questions to inquire into the different systems that are in place in a child's life, the child, the family, their wider network, and indeed the professional network. How can we bring in those people to have a collective conversation about, well, what is the problem? Is there a shared understanding of what the problem is before we start landing in, as Rick said, maybe more services and more things that just add maybe greater complexity to the situation and doesn't suit or address the family's needs or issues in that context. We've also, I think, tried to approach safety planning from the perspective of that active involvement of a network. So bringing in those wider systems at play and thinking about how they can contribute or support increasing safety around a child in that context, and recognizing the complicating factors perhaps in a family situation, as well as the adult behavior that's impacting on harm to children, can also include things like poor professional relationships with the family, things like homelessness, things that all those other things that can also add complexity to addressing harm for children. So how do we bring that into the discussion and think through in an adaptive, creative way with people how to that? And within that system approach, you get to interplay with, maybe as complexity theory talks about, the attractors or the influencers that are in play in that system too, because some will be positive and some will be negative in terms of how how that impacts on a child's situation. And then, of course, testing that hypothesis, adapting, flexing to it, and trying to build, as we talk, a safety planning process. A lot of times there's a focus on the plan, but in fact, what we're actually talking about is how do we build a safety planning process that over time can establish increased safety to children, and bring in that wider systems perspective to that. And of course, still paying attention to ultimately and probably over time addressing more fundamental ingrained challenges and problems that people have, but trying to get to safety first, because it's much harder to address those bigger maybe challenges when we haven't even got a child to a safe position yet. The other thing we're trying to be doing, I suppose, is minimizing error and that risk, and Monroe has talked about that. How do you minimize error and that kind of practice paternalism? I think that sometimes can happen. Can we admit that we're wrong and reflect on that? And Caroline's talked about that. How do you build in that reflection into it? I think it's so understandable in a very busy, demanding child protection environment that's highly regulated, highly compliance focused. It's much quicker to tell people what the problem is, what the solution is, and what to do about it, than actually sit with them and help them figure out what that problem is and what that solution might be. And that's a continuous challenge. So at an organizational level, then, I think trying to support that type of practice, that has led to really deep and hard thinking about the type of changes that you need to make in an organization, and they are many. One is trying to establish a much stronger learning environment for staff to kind of support them in thinking about practice. And then there's a multitude of things, Rick, that the organization has to pay attention to change that could derail the practice or derail your intention, I suppose, for a better outcome. In the learning space, we've had to think a lot more about not just training, but active learning of people, developing tools, like Caroline, I think, mentioned about joint reflection tools with staff that examine not only the quality of the practice, but the quality of engagement perhaps that's happening with the family in relation to that, using group supervision to open up thinking about practice so you minimize error by bringing in different perspectives on the problem, creating learning cases to look at really complex needs, problems, and that, so that we begin to figure out what safety planning might look like in the context of child sexual exploitation or serious child sexual abuse, or indeed what's the system-wide learning we can develop from working through one of those complex cases, and what does that tell us? And within that space, trying to tackle those wider system changes that make that job, as you refer, good for the worker, I suppose, that they'll want to do. And that means revising policy, revising processes and forms, changing the IT system, changing how we approach quality assurance mechanisms, tackling recruitment and retention challenges. These are massive organization things that I think complexity theory helps us point to and helps us think about how will we need to adjust the system to support the type of practice and indeed the outcomes we want to achieve. And within all of that, and I'm conscious of time, I suppose, what are the prevailing complexities that I still see at play in the system that we're trying to maybe change? Is there is always an innate desire to proceduralize practice that comes from outside the organization, it comes from inside the organization, because I think the fundamental problem, you touched on this, Rick, around uncertainty, is that there is a desire sometimes to go back to that managerialized approach to proceduralize things, because if we have a procedure and everyone follows the same thing, then we'll always get the same outcome. And we all know that that simply isn't the case. But there's a comfort in that too. There's a comfort for staff who are working in anxiety, I think, to have a procedure to follow. And then at least if I follow the procedure and something goes wrong, well, at least I have the fallback to say I followed the procedure, as opposed to having a much more adaptive, flexible practice approach that demands a lot more, I think, of staff. And I would say complex practice, of course, requires a complex practice approach, but it also requires fundamentally, and we've learned this, a very high level of skill and knowledge before people can even use that practice approach effectively. So people, and picking up on Caroline's point, a practice approach alone isn't enough to try and help us think through the problems. People need a deep understanding of the impact of complicating factors. They need a strong value base. They need expert knowledge in a whole range of areas in order to inform their thinking about using their practice approach. It itself is not a magic bullet and never will be. And if nothing else, complex practice requires the one thing that bedevils all of us, which is time. For practitioners, time to do the work and time to reflect on the work and time to bring other people into the work. And that is a constant, I suppose, challenge that as an organization we continue to face, and how to increase time back to social workers and social care workers in doing the work. In addition to that, and just as a kind of wrap up, obviously creating a culture of accountability and not blame is a critical component of that. I don't think we are challenged in the same way, perhaps, as the English system has been challenged in terms of how it's tackled, maybe crises in child deaths or otherwise. But I think in staff surveys that we've done, we can definitely see elements of that still at play, and we need to pay attention to that, I think, as it impacts on the work. Integration with other practice in the organization, we've learned to you land one practice model in, has had a knock-on effect on other practice approaches in the organization. And how do we think about that? Because it doesn't make sense to us, but it doesn't make sense for families if we don't have a way of integrating how we work with families across a range of needs in that context. And last, of course, but not least, we can't forget the wider system that even impacts on our organization. Legislation and policy change has huge impact on our practice, and indeed our work to try and advocate and collaborate around wider system change around those big bedeviling challenges of poverty, homelessness, addiction, social isolation. They all have a massive impact, I think, on the quality of work we can do, the quality of practice it takes to intervene to try and address those and advocate for change in those areas, and the things, of course, that make children much more susceptible to harm. So thanks, and I'll hand back now to John, I think, for the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Cormac, and thank you to Caroline and Rick for really stimulating presentations. So I'm going to kick off by just maybe feeding back on a few of the points that have been made in the chat so far. I suppose just maybe an emphasis on the significance of joint training or interprofessional training at pre-service, and continuing as a key, I suppose, way to respond to the challenge of complexity, recognizing community assets, and working from that. I suppose experiencing, Rick had a very nice point, which was what matters to the person. I think this idea of starting there, and I think there's some interesting questions that flow from that. A suggestion really that we need more time to spend thinking about understanding the situations. And I see just something in from PD, which might be Pat Dolan, I think, and it really is, how do we actually respect the voice of families in complexity theory, and then also just a question about how do we evaluate in the context of complexity approaches to service and systems. delivery. So there's probably a lot in there. There's also a question in international context about how do we actually maybe engage with complexity in international development contexts where organizations are responding to basic needs, and maybe some of the references that have been provided by Rick would respond to that, but also there might be some additional resources. My suggestion would be maybe we would pick up on the question around evaluation. And maybe would Rick, would you have some maybe thoughts on how do we approach evaluation in this context of complexity, and is it possible? It's something myself and Aisling have been kicking around now in the last few months, and be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, John. I'm mindful, I think, that you've got us the next webinar is going to be devoted to this, isn't it? Is that right, Aisling?
No, so the next one is public services, and we will have a further one in the autumn time, and we can probably say Ollie Monroe at this stage has agreed to do that with us, but we'll be advertising that as the third of the seminars.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm not stepping on anyone's
no.
toes there. Yeah, it's a. I suppose one thought I have is that we're often. So measurement, what do you measure, you know, in child protection? So we're often keen to evaluate interventions, but then we're completely unclear about what the purpose of service is and how to measure that. So there's a big debate in England at the moment about a proposal that the government has to have a dashboard of performance indicators, which. But what it's highlighted is the fact that we don't actually have any good measures of anything particularly meaningful in the sense of outcomes. You know, so is it better to do more child protection investigations or fewer? What's the right level? Often when we're developing new interventions, they're not really standalone. They come in the context of a system. So one of the problems you have with evaluations is you pick an outcome measure, let's say rates of children entering the care system, let's say in a given year, but that it might be the intervention is designed to kind of reduce that. But how do you know whether that's a good thing or not? You know, in terms of levels of need in the community and which children should or shouldn't be in care. You can certainly say that overall your ambition and your goal is to have fewer children in the care system. Of course, you could try having less poverty and deprivation and financial hardship, and see if that affects numbers of children in care. But instead, we kind of have a very kind of localized practice intervention, and then want to evaluate that in terms of its impact on a very global kind of measure. So I think that's one thing, is that if we're honest about wanting to address complexity, then we also need to be honest about the context in which these interventions occur. And it's one of my big problems with the latest review of children's social care in England, which had some merits and did call for more investment in the sector, but then wanted to treat things like decision making and practice frameworks completely separately from the question of austerity and poverty and deprivation and racism and structural disadvantage. So you can't be hypocritical. If you want to evaluate complexity, then you have to take into account context. So that's I can feel myself kind of wanting to talk for an hour on this. So sure. Maybe the other thing to mention is that there are in health, this has been taken very seriously in healthcare, and there are extremely good, I think, models out there around how to evaluate the complex impact of interventions, and there's lots of literature on that. And I suppose the final point is to say, well, do people mean evaluation or implementation? Because there is a difference, and I think often the two are maybe mixed up a little bit. Maybe to pause there, because there might be something more. So yeah, measures, context, and implementation.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points in the Q&A as well. One, that there's really from a practice perspective, that continuing experience of meetings taking place in silos and parents and foster care is excluded, for example, You know, so that's one point. And I think also from one of our senior leaders in services, Ger, really asking an interesting question. Well, what happens then if we open up a variety of responses and creating options for people, that makes it a bit more difficult in the context of providing a consistent services, consistent or equality of service. And that is something I would be really have thought about for many, many years. You know, why is it that somebody in Kerry gets a different service from somebody in Dublin if they actually have the same needs and the same contexts? So we'd be interested from either Caroline or Cormac or Rick on that point about the challenge of, you know, variety of responses versus consistency in complex situations.
I mean, but I would say that maybe consistency doesn't have to mean it's standardized. I'll leave it at that because I think maybe Caroline and Cormac might have more to say.
Yeah, I would agree just with what Rick has just said. I think it's a good, very good opening. I think what we've tried to aim for is a consistent approach to thinking about these things, but that doesn't mean to say a proceduralized way that everyone gets the exact same response. There's levels of nuance within assessment and safety planning, even within a consistent practice approach that has to tailor itself to the individual needs of that family. So you can bring a consistent framework to your thinking, but that doesn't mean a proceduralized response or the same response to every child or every family in that context. But I think what we were bedeviled with is it's very hard to build confidence in a child protection and welfare system as well if we have 14 different assessment frameworks being used around the country, or we have a variety of different ways of screening cases in and out of services, or that certainly from the experience of children, families and partners, they find that hugely confusing. And bedeviling that one national service has such a variety of fundamental approach to its practice that it makes it very difficult for people to, I think, have confidence and reassurance in that. Plus, it's much harder, if we go back to the measurement bit, it's much harder to measure effectiveness if everyone's doing something completely different, because what are you measuring as well? So, and that's a critical kind of challenge, I think, in that space too.
And just very briefly, John, if you want to add, I suppose just to kind of link in with the earlier point as well about the silo approach and the inclusion of families and how we respect and hear the voice of families. I suppose, you know, really whatever approach we're taking, complexity theory, it's also with a wider lens of us being aware of, we have to find a way to communicate what we do. There's a huge issue around still public awareness and public understanding, and how we communicate that complexity. But, you know, when we say we're all part of the system, we have to see that kind of the families and the young people are at the center, the fulcrum of that system. And sort of that lens, like through civic engagement and partnership, I think there's a much bigger conceptual lens that we need to kind of apply, that we see families and the community and the public as in here with us resolving this issue, as opposed to, I think, looking onto or into the issue.
Yeah, and just to come in on that as well, I think, I mean, even in the work that we've done, I suppose we have tried to pay attention to parents' perspectives. We did a parent survey. We've just about to publish a child survey of their experience of the Child Protection Welfare Service. That's at a kind of a research global level. But on the practice, I suppose we are trying to, but particularly maybe in relation to the point that the person was making, I suppose, we're having to relook at our practice, I think, around children and care, even in care planning. I think we do have to think hard. Certainly, I think what foster care is, children, even in the development of our thinking around care planning, we've had a lot of feedback about how inclusive people feel in that. I think planning journey around children. And I think as we're revising that, because we have to now, in the context of new changes for trying to focus on permanency for children and legislative change, I think it is opening up a strong debate about how do we make sure that everyone in that network, if I make a reference to that, is actively part of that planning and engagement process, because there's such a critical part, if we think about systems theory, in what's going to affect positively or negatively on change around perhaps that young person.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Cormac, and thanks, colleagues. I think we're just a little bit over the 2 o'clock, so I'm just going to hand back to Aisling for the thank yous and the wrap-ups, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, John, and thank you very much, Professor Rick Hood, Professor Caroline McGregor, and Cormac Quinlan from Tusla Child Family Agency for just a really strong discussion this afternoon. I'm just briefly just going to go back to the fundamentals of your last slide, Rick, you know, designing the fundamentals of practice, you know, that it is about the local practice, the variety brought into decision making, you know. So it's if you're trying to think today about how do you apply this, it's bringing variety into decision making. Consistency does, you know, is not the same as standardization. I think that's really interesting as a thought. And just the use of critical analysis, a learning environment that Cormac talked about and that Caroline talked about, you know, that we fundamentally need a learning environment. And then what John said and what Rick said, what matters to families, you know, families and children at the center of it. And that's the whole thing about open communication systems, of which we are all part in terms of the decision-making that's going on. So I'll not say any more because one couldn't possibly summarize such a rich discussion. But just to mention in brief, our webinar for next week, Complexity Theory in Public Services, focused on the systemic and dynamic characteristics of complexity theory and their application to public sector systems. Our main speaker will be Dr. Mary Lee Rhodes, Associate Professor of Public Management and Co-Director of the Centre for Social Innovation at Trinity College Dublin. She has a lot of experience in evaluation of cross-border community projects using a complexity frame of reference. So that might be interesting for people who did raise questions around complexity theory and evaluation. And our respondent will be Dr. Fergal Lynch, Senior Lead, Government and Public Policy Engagement, Institute for Life course here in University of Galway. So thank you all very much. Thank you for participating today, and thank you all for listening. And
maybe just a final thank you to Gillian Brown for
Gillian
organising us and getting everything set up.